All right, so we're talking about Key Concept 7.3 today, which you can see participation in a series of global conflicts propelled the United States into a position of international power while renewing domestic debates over the nation's proper role in the world. Our time period here is still 1890 to 1945, although I'm going to define it more as 1898 to 1945, and that's because in 1898, the first of our three conflicts that we'll be looking at, the Spanish-American War, occurs. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the debates that had started prior to that in the 1890s in America. But by and large, this unit, Unit 3, is about three wars: Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II, and how America sees itself in the world. So our big idea questions relate to tradition, primarily an isolationist tradition, versus the present that the United States sees themselves in, and the future that the United States is trying to visualize. So what were the arguments for and against U.S. expansion overseas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Some of those will probably be familiar to you. This is all pre-World War I. For that big idea question. The second one, how did World War I and World War II challenge the U.S.'s tradition of neutrality? And what ways did the U.S. change its view and remain the same? We're going to find that very basically World War I doesn't change too much, and World War II changes a whole heck of a lot. And relating to that, the third key question here, big idea question, what impacts did World War II have on the home front as well as the United States' position in the world? Oftentimes, historians will speak of pre-1945 and post-1945 United States because the changes are just so remarkable. All right, so this is Roman numeral 1 here under our key concept, and there it is. Late 19th, early 20th centuries, the United States gets some territorial ambitions and acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere as well as the Pacific. And so this is pre-Spanish-American War, although the Spanish-American War is going to fall under this key concept as well. And so you have these two groups essentially who are arguing about what to make of this. Imperialists say that we need to expand, that the rest of the world has been expanding for hundreds of years if you're talking about Europe, and that expansion has accelerated in the 1880s in Africa, for example, but also in Southeast Asia. And so the United States needs to get in on this. For economic opportunities, expanding markets, this is a very common argument made by capitalists who are saying capitalism and capitalist countries demand markets for goods. So Hawaii is a great example of this with plantations. Imperialists are also making racial arguments, racial theories. This is the time period of social Darwinism and scientific racism. And so the argument here, which you all are probably familiar with through Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, is that it's the duty of these white Christian European nations to go out and civilize the rest of the world. Imperialists are making that argument all throughout the 1890s. Sorry, just had a brief interruption there. I apologize if I stopped in the middle of a thought. We'll move on to the idea of the frontier being closed, which is another argument that imperialists are making. Frederick Jackson Turner is the one who you should associate with this argument, his frontier thesis, which is something you should know. He argues that the American frontier is what has made the American character, that it has shaped us as a people, and that now the frontier is closed. By the time we get to the 1890 census, we can see that the frontier is closed. And so the implication of that is that we need to find a new frontier. We need to go beyond just the continental borders of the United States. Not surprisingly, there are a number of Americans who are against this, who would consider themselves anti-imperialists. Their arguments stand in direct contrast to the imperialists in many ways. So self-determination is a big one, whereas imperialists will argue for the white man's burden, and that it is our duty as a country to uplift, improve, Christianize these countries. Anti-imperialists will say, no one did that for us. I mean, the French helped us during the American Revolution, but by and large, we had to uplift ourselves. And so self-determination is the way to go. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the Spanish-American War, but this is one of the loudest arguments that's made after the Spanish-American War when the United States decides to colonize the Philippines. The second argument that anti-imperialists make, and these are in no particular order, is the tradition of isolationism, that this is a breach of American protocol going back to our very founding, that we have always been an isolationist country, and that as a country, the successes we have achieved have come in part from our isolation, from our focus inward rather than our focus outward. Think back to George Washington's farewell address here, where he argues against entangling foreign alliances. That's been a really important thread throughout American history, at least the anti-imperialists are arguing. So the Spanish-American War is going to challenge a lot of this in 1898. So the United States defeats Spain pretty quickly. It's nicknamed the Splendid Little War. Most of the fighting takes place in Cuba, but we are also fighting in the Philippines, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the Spanish-American War is caused by this war fervor that is built up through some of the yellow journalists. William Randolph Hearst is the name that you'll want to associate with this. And the USS Maine blows up off the coast of Cuba in 1898 and is very quickly blamed on the Spanish. In fact, historical evidence will show that the Maine's boiler probably exploded, and this had almost nothing to do with the Spanish. But Americans at the time wanted war. They didn't like the Spanish being in the hemisphere. Americans always saw themselves as the protectors of the hemisphere, and it was time for the Europeans to go. And so out of this splendid little war, the United States gained territories. The United States had territories before. Think Hawaii, think Alaska. But look at where these territories are. Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, okay. Puerto Rico, a little further than that, but still in the Caribbean. But Guam and the Philippines are the two that stick out. Now we're talking about territories that are separated by the entirety of the Pacific Ocean. And so the question is, what do we do with these territories? In terms of Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States today, so we know what we do with Puerto Rico. Cuba is given its independence, but the United States passes something called the Platt Amendment, which basically says that we are the ones who are in charge of Cuba's defense, thereby giving the United States sovereignty over Cuba for the most part. And so what we see then is that the United States begins to assert its control over the Caribbean. And the Roosevelt corollary, Teddy Roosevelt we're talking about here, is a addition to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says this is our hemisphere and Europeans should stay out. The Roosevelt corollary adds on to that and says that the United States is in charge of protecting all peoples in the hemisphere. Interesting one. Not surprisingly, we see challenges to this from nationalist leaders like Emilio Aguinaldo, who's pictured here, Filipino nationalist leader. He fought alongside the United States when we were fighting against the Spanish. And after the Spanish-American War, the United States said, you know what, I think we're going to hold on to the Philippines because we actually paid Spain $20 million for it. People like Emilio Aguinaldo said, well, what about self-determination? What about all that stuff you told us? Rise up against the Spanish oppressors, the imperialist oppressors. Now you, the United States, sure seem like an imperialist oppressor. We actually fought a very bloody war in the Philippines to suppress it and to colonize it in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. So into Roman numeral II. World War I. So World War I intensified these ongoing debates about the nation's role in the world, as well as how best to secure the present and the future for the United States. We're talking about national security for the most part here. So the United States remained neutral. War breaks out in 1914 in Europe. You all know that story there. The United States is eventually dragged into the war. And when it does this, the United States departs from its long tradition of non-involvement in European affairs. We have been meddling in other countries' affairs for a little while prior to World War I, but we had never gotten involved in European affairs outside of our hemisphere. This is the first time that happens in 1917, and that's a really big deal. It happens because of Germany. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 because the Germans were getting desperate, and American shipping was helping the British. And the Germans also sent what's called the Zimmermann Note, or the Zimmermann Telegram, to Mexico saying, hey, why don't you guys invade the United States, and when this whole war is over in Europe, we'll help you out. Those two things together really forced the United States' hand, forced Woodrow Wilson's hand. And they joined the war in the spring of 1917. So Woodrow Wilson is the key player in all of this. He's the president from 1913 until 1921, elected in 1912 and 1916. Woodrow Wilson is the architect in many ways of the war. But what we're more interested in, the war from the American side, I should say, what we're more interested in is what his vision for the post-war world is and America's role in that. Wilson is very clear on this. He comes up with his 14 points, capital F, capital P, and I'm not going to give you all the points. You don't need to know all of them, but the basic gist of them is that the United States needs to be a beacon of light in the world and that we are fighting this war to make it safe for democracy. Not much of that is going to come to pass. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the United States entered the war in 1917. Entrance tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. Truth be told, Germany was going to be forced to surrender at some point. The British blockade of Germany was starving them out, starving their country. They were really struggling to fight the war. But hundreds of thousands of American troops, fresh troops who hadn't been fighting in the trenches for years and years, helped to reinvigorate the Allied side. But it's important to note that if we were to go over to Europe and take a look at World War I, from the European perspective, America played a very tertiary role, a supporting role, as it were, and that we should have gotten involved much sooner than we actually did. It's going to be the same refrain in World War II as well. So Wilson comes up with his 14 points, says nations need to have self-determination, European countries need to give up all their colonies, we need to make the world safe for democracy, all these really, really nice things that a lot of the other nations of the world, the non-European nations, the colonized nations, really like and really buy into. And he also says that the peace after World War I needs to be a just peace that is not founded on revenge, that is not bitter, but that is a peace that can last. He gets basically none of what he wants in the Treaty of Versailles. And we took a look at this in world history, so hopefully some of this is sounding familiar. But the British and the French go to Paris for the negotiations, and they say, you Americans helped us win the war, that's wonderful, but we've been fighting this war for far longer than you, and we're also going to have to live next to Germany. We're going to have to live with the ramifications of this. So Woodrow Wilson is only successful in getting the British and the French to agree to the League of Nations, which is it's his most important point of the 14, and this is the precursor to the United Nations. The problem for Wilson is that he has to convince the United States Congress, because Congress are the only ones who can ratify a treaty. And so even though Wilson was heavily involved in the post-war negotiations, Congress has no interest in ratifying the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty is harsh on Germany, which Congress doesn't really care about, but what Congress really cares about is this League of Nations and how it's going to suck America into future conflicts in Europe. There are people like Henry Cabot Lodge who went along with World War I begrudgingly because the United States has to protect its national interests. You have unrestricted submarine warfare. We have to defend ourselves. Fine, sure. But then their vision for the future is, okay, we won the war. Time to go back to the way things were. This is not Wilson's vision, and people like Henry Cabot Lodge and the other irreconcilables, as they're called, say there is no way that the United States is going to join the League of Nations because it could take away Congress's power to declare war. And so here we have interjected into this really important debate is Washington's farewell address. This idea that America is first and foremost an isolationist country who has no interest in being involved in European affairs. You see a lot of political cartoons on the AP exam. This is a really famous one. You can see the title down there, The Gap in the Bridge, and the bridge representing a League of Nations. Designed by the president, but yet Uncle Sam representing Congress, American people, who are by and large isolationists, whoever it is. You can see Uncle Sam is unwilling to put the keystone into the bridge, which is the most important piece. It's the piece that would hold the bridge together. The implication here, of course, is that the United States is the ones who pushed for the League of Nations, or at least Woodrow Wilson was, and yet they're the ones who are going to be responsible for its failure. Foreign policy throughout the 1920s and 1930s is not really something that's discussed too much in terms of broad American history, and that's because America is really concerned with other things after World War I. We have the Roaring Twenties, America turns inward. We have the Great Depression, America again turns inward for a very different reason. So we do have foreign policy, obviously, but it's really taking a backseat to what's going on domestically. If we were to take a look at that foreign policy, we would see that the United States is pursuing a unilateral policy that is most interested in international investment, dollar diplomacy, capital D, the United States banks and corporations investing in foreign countries and trying to exert influence through economic means. That's the big way that the United States is conducting its foreign policy during the 1920s and 1930s. We do have a series of conferences that take place in the 1920s in an attempt to make sure that another world war doesn't happen. The Washington Naval Conference is a good example of this. You get a couple treaties out of this, the 5-Power Treaty and the 9-Power Treaty. These treaties are just going to be ignored by the time you get to the 1930s. They're an attempt to make sure that this peace is a lasting peace, but ultimately their significance is that they fail. If anything, they help us learn about our mistakes post-World War I and the post-World War II world, but that's really it. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, which I also probably should have put in here, it's in your concepts. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is another one, which outlawed war amongst the signatory nations, which is a great idea. You can guess how that went. Well, the United States is intervening in certain areas of the world, mostly in Latin America, to protect what are viewed as American interests there. Nicaragua is a good example of this. We intervened in 1912. We intervened again in 1933 for reasons of national interest. Nicaragua is close to Panama. It's right next to Panama. We have the Panama Canal, of course. So we do see some select military interventions, but our military after World War I really shrinks down to our traditional, really small standing army. And so the big thing here is that the United States maintains isolationism. We do not join the League of Nations. We actually do send delegates to the League of Nations, but they are only there to observe. They are non-voting, non-participatory members. Throughout the 1930s, a series of neutrality acts get passed as war with Europe, war within Europe is looking increasingly likely. I should say war in Asia as well, because China invades Japan in 1937. The United States Congress is it passes 3 of them, a series of neutrality acts, which are forbidding trading with warring nations. This is in an attempt to keep the United States out of World War II. And so on the eve of our entrance into war, which is December 7th, 1941, I guess December 8th, 1941 technically is when we declare war, most Americans, the majority of Americans, oppose military action. Now you have to put it in the context of the time. Japan invaded China. Did I say China invaded Japan before? I apologize if I did. Brain's not working. Japan invaded China in 1937, and the United States stays out of that for 4 years, despite the fact that this is absolutely a threat to American interests in the region, and China had been an ally. And the United States stayed out of the war in Europe. And by late 1941, the only country left standing the only 2 countries are Britain and the Soviet Union. Germany has steamrolled everybody else. It really does take Pearl Harbor to get us into this war. We see groups like the America First Committee, who are against U.S. intervention in the war. Charles Lindbergh is a really prominent member of the America First Committee. He's going to get a bad reputation for that once Pearl Harbor happens. And so yeah, when you associate isolationism with pre-World War II, I want you to think about the America First Committee. Well, here we are, Roman numeral 3, and Roman numeral 3 is World War II. I want you to take a close look at the language here and the wording here. So, U.S. participation in the war transformed American society. while the victory of the United States and its allies over the Axis powers vaulted the U.S. into a position of global political and military leadership. I mean, you can contrast what happens after World War II to what happens after World War I, where Woodrow Wilson shows up and he's expecting to get a bunch of his 14 points into the treaty, and Britain and France just kind of pat him on the head and say, "That's nice, thanks for the help, go back to your hemisphere." After World War II, the United States is unquestioningly the most powerful country in the world, and it is the global leader, certainly of the Western world. The Soviet Union will stand in opposition to that for the East. So how did Americans view the war? Americans justified the war in a number of different ways, but very clearly they saw it as a fight for freedom and democracy against totalitarianism and dictatorships. And that's a pretty fair characterization of the war. This is later reinforced by Japanese atrocities that are committed during the war, the Bataan Death March. One of these atrocities, where American POWs in the Philippines are forced to march across the entirety of the island. Many of them, I think about a third of them, die on the march, are just left for dead on the roadside. And, of course, the Holocaust, Nazi concentration camps, which the full scale and scope of which was not known to the outside world until very late in the war. And so this characterization of World War II as a fight for freedom and democracy, as a fight to help the oppressed against oppressors, is one which has stood the test of time. A lot of wars are justified in this way for freedom and democracy, but when we kind of shine the light of historical interpretation on them over the years, that kind of falls apart. You know, the Vietnam War is a great example of this. It's justified in the same way. We're fighting for South Vietnam's freedom. We're fighting for the democratic South Vietnam against North Vietnam. But it is very much murkier than that. World War II, not so much. And this is why a very famous book about World War II by one of my favorite historian names, Studs Terkel, great name. He called it the Good War. And he used that term partially satirically, you know, can there ever be a good war? But also a lot of Americans remember World War II as a good war. It was a war that needed to be fought. It was necessary. All wars are evil, but wars can be more necessary than others. Because Americans buy into the war once Pearl Harbor happens, American society is mobilized in a way that it has never mobilized for anything before World War II or since World War II. This mass mobilization helped end the Great Depression. It ended the Great Depression. America had been mobilizing prior to World War II, but after Pearl Harbor, it becomes complete. All areas of American society show that they are helping the war effort. You know, our industrial base helped win the war, of course, by providing equipment, provisions, troops for the war effort. But it really did go beyond this, because you have women who are working in non-traditional female roles. This is happening during World War I, but it's happening on a massive scale during World War II. So Rosie the Riveter is a classic example of this. And minorities are also asked to participate in this war in large numbers. And the key here for us is that a lot of these minorities are going to take from the war effort perspective on their place in American society. So African Americans who still serve in segregated units, this will be the last war that Americans fight in segregated units. African Americans are fighting on the front lines of both Europe and Japan. African Americans are working in factories. And this is the antecedents of the modern civil rights movement, because you're going to have millions of African Americans who participate in this war effort in numerous ways come back to a post-World War II America and say, wait a second, this isn't right. We just fought a war for freedom and democracy. How can you say that segregation is the law of the land? How can you say that I'm a lesser American? And so mobilization and World War II leads to debates over racial segregation. Executive Order 8802 is an example of this, where A. Philip Randolph helped to lead the fight for this. A. Philip Randolph, very famous African-American union activist. eliminated discrimination in defense industries, and the Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad, victory over racism at home, is another great example of how World War II is forcing these discussions on America, these discussions that we may have had in the past, but we really don't like to have as a country. And that is, who are we as a nation? What role does race or gender play in Americanness? World War II absolutely affects those things. The military remained segregated until the Korean War. I think it's desegregated officially in 1948, right before the Korean War. And so we also see challenges to civil liberties during the war. We saw this in World War I with the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. We see this in World War II with the internment of Japanese Americans. Over 140,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them Nisei, I'm not quite sure how to say that word, but two-thirds of them born in America. These are not naturalized American citizens, people who were born in Japan and immigrate here. These are Japanese Americans who are born here. Over 140,000 of them are imprisoned for the duration of the war, and they are imprisoned while some of their family members are fighting in Europe. They are not allowed to fight in the Pacific, but they are allowed to fight in Europe. So just picture yourself in that situation. You're a young 20, 21, 22-year-old Japanese American man who was born in this country, and you are risking your life for your country while your parents, your grandparents, your sisters, your brothers are imprisoned out west. This is actually challenged in the Supreme Court, and it is upheld in a court case known as Korematsu v. United States. We'll take a look at this in class. The Supreme Court held that at times of war, civil liberties are, to an extent, a luxury. A huge court case, which we'll take a look in class. So the United States and the Allies do win the war. Why do they win the war? United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union all managed to get away from their differences. I'm talking mostly about the Soviet Union here, and to cooperate to fight the war. The Soviet Union sacrifices a massive amount in terms of men and material for the war effort. I shouldn't say men. Human and material costs are staggering for the Soviet Union. The Tehran Conference is one of the first. There are 3 wartime conferences: Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, about how to fight the war and what the world should look like after the war. So that's an example of Allied cooperation there. Technological, should probably be technological, and scientific advances. The Manhattan Project. America is the first country to enter into the nuclear age, develop the atomic bomb. We are still the only country, at least at the time of this recording, to have used a nuclear weapon, which we use on Japan on August 6th and August 9th, 1945. Of course, the use of the atomic bombs helped to end the war. Saying they ended the war is a bit hyperbolic. They helped to end the war. And of course, they sparked debates about these types of weapons. Sonar is another good example of technological and scientific advances. Computing technology, computers, radar. There are so many things that we have in today's world because of the need for those things during World War II. So, reasons for U.S. and Allied victory: servicemen and women. Millions of Americans fought in the war alongside millions of other people from different nations, but we can't forget about them. And the actual military campaigns themselves. The island hopping campaign is the military campaign in the Pacific, where the United States is hopping from island to island, trying to get as close to Japan as possible. And in Europe, the D-Day invasion. Hopefully that's not cut off for you. June 6, 1944. Dwight D. Eisenhower, there he is right there. He will be president in the 1950s, 53 to 61. But he was the supreme Allied commander, and he was the one who led the invasion, who planned and executed the invasion. D-Day the day of days. So the end of the war. The United States emerges as the most powerful nation due to a few things. Asia and Europe are a mess. There is no fighting on American soil. The last war that was fought on American soil was the War of 1812, if you're talking about a foreign invasion, or the Civil War. If you're not, of course, Pearl Harbor is attacked. Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii, and it's American territory. Asia and Europe are not so lucky, and they are completely devastated by the war. Air power, aircraft, changed the level of devastation. Whereas World War I, there was a lot of devastation. It was localized to where the trenches were. World War II, Asia and Europe have seen almost a decade, when you're talking about Asia, of full-scale, massive war. And that has destroyed their economies. So the United States has the dominant role in the Allied victory in the post-war settlements. We push for the creation of the United Nations. We are still a permanent member of the Security Council. And this is when we see the ultimate departure from Washington's farewell address. This traditional isolationism that existed is washed away. You could argue it's washed away on December 7th, 1941 with Pearl Harbor. But it is gone forever. There is no chance of it coming back after the peace of World War II. The College Board asks about World War II, but not in the traditional ways. Knowing the battles is really not important. Understanding the wars themselves, not really important. You know, a lot of this stuff is arguments for and against U.S. expansion, so that's late 19th, early 20th century stuff. They like to ask about the Treaty of Versailles and the 14 points, because this is hotly debated in America at the time, and it's related to who we are as a country. Reasons for victories in World War I and World War II I've seen questions about, and the domestic impact. And that's sort of related to this here. You know, social impacts of World War II, stuff the College Board loves to ask about. Comparing and contrasting the United States' role in the post-World War I and post-World War II worlds, that's a classic question. So I would encourage you, don't focus too much on the events of the wars. It's important to know them. It's important context. Focus on causes and effects. And hopefully through this guided lecture you've seen that, especially for effects, there's a lot to take in here. And we're going to spend a good deal of time looking at those in class. So hope it was helpful. If you have any questions about it, we can, of course, address it in class. Thanks.